I don't know that the Constitution has had the kind of legal pressure on it that it has had in the last 6 weeks ever in the history of the Republic. But there's one guy who can tell us. He is the co-host of the Oath and Office podcast, and he's the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. He is a brilliant mind out of Brown University and a friend of the show. Corey Brettschneider, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. What a pleasure to be with you, and looking forward to the conversation. And thanks for that intro. I have a new part of my biography, as you said, which is that John Fugelsang and I, for the last 4 weeks, have felt the urgency that you were just talking about in your introduction about the threat to the Constitution that we're seeing. And so we've started a podcast called The Oath and the Office. When you and I first met, I had written a book called The Oath and the Office.
Thank you. I was just about to note that. Yeah, exactly. Who knew that it would turn into a podcast?
Yeah.
And Fugelsang is brilliant. So that's a great pairing, the two of you together. I can't wait to check it out. Wasn't aware of it, so glad we could get the word out. So
yeah, we're already, sorry, I mean, I'll attribute all the success to John, but we're already at the top of the government category because I think people really want to know what's going on. But when you often hear the news, even through outlets like NPR, it's a little dry. And so John brings a lot of levity and comedy.
Yes.
And of course, I'm the straight man and, giving as much serious analysis as I can. And so we've been doing this show on Sirius XM. Actually, Mark, I think the way I know you is that I used to do John's show with David Feldman, and I know he introduced us years ago. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's and Fugelsang is great. There he is, looking his most handsome, and there you are,
very professorial.
You're most exactly most credible. So it's terrific, and we'll mention it again at the end of this conversation. I really like that we're. That you're out there with it, and congratulations on the success. So, well, maybe I'll start with what you've been talking about on the podcast then. I hadn't intended to, but what is the thing that has floated to the top? Because there's a lot of competition for what should get the kind of media oxygen that raises public consciousness.
I think what's unique about what we're doing is that while there are a lot of shows, a lot of podcasts talking about the news that are terrific, what we're trying to do is really look to connect the dots and to see each of these particular stories. I'm sure we'll talk about the Khalil story, for instance, the salesman job of selling Teslas, to connect it to the assault on the Constitution. And the idea really is, as you and I have often talked about, that there are constitutional protections in a democracy that are supposed to be honored. And ideally, they're going to be honored by the court. But part of what we're about is the idea that it might not be. So we're as critical of the president as we often are of the court. And it's an attempt to really make good on that promise of citizens defending the Constitution. There is no Constitution police. It's not self-executing. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to galvanize support behind it and to, cover the particular stories, but also to weave them together. And this is, I think, not an unprecedented assault on democracy. That my book, The Presidents and the People, I should thank you too, because after, there are a few, I did a podcast with Preet Bharara, MSNBC. Some shows can really boost sales of The Presidents and the People and help me get my message out. And yours was incredible. You have such a close listenership, and I'm so grateful to so many in your audience who bought the book and I've been, writing reviews, and so
I'm so glad to hear that. We have a lot of smart people, and they're activated. They're anxious to know what can be done. They want to learn more, and then they act on what they've learned. So, well, you mentioned Khalil, so maybe I'll start that conversation, and we'll get to some of this other stuff like federal layoffs and now rehirings, et cetera. Yeah. So the Khalil thing was interesting, and you also kind of mentioned the Tesla thing, because the Tesla protests that were kind of adjacent to the Tesla pitchman crap that was going on at the White House, that's a weaponization, I would suggest, of the Justice Department, characterizing, for those who don't know, protests against Tesla. Now, you can maybe help me with whether they mention violence or whether they just mention protest. I can't recall what it is, but as an act of terrorism. And by doing that, it's a whole separate category of prosecution and of sentencing. I know this from the animal rights movement. Many of my friends in animal rights have been prosecuted as terrorists.
Mm.
It's a horrifying thing. I mean, just for protesting and blocking the entrance, for example, to a slaughterhouse or whatever it might be. Actually, it wasn't even that. In the case of the ones I'm thinking of, it was a bank that was funding a lot of laboratory testing of animals, and that's why they were protesting. But anyway, to this point, so on the one hand, you have the Tesla protesters being classified as terrorists, and on the other hand, you have this Khalil, who is who is now being both, I would suggest, pursued by this administration, I mean, relentlessly, and now maybe at the 11th hour here has a little bit of running room. You can now maybe put some coherence to what I just said. But.
Yeah, no, that's a great intro. I mean, and I think there is a common element, which is that Trump and the Justice Department now, I should say, part of what he's done that makes this very different than Trump 1.0 is in Trump 1.0, there was a lot of pushback. Members of the civil service, including within the Justice Department, would say you can't do that. And he's really establishing a kind of iron fist order by firing everyone who's not loyal to his vision. So what he says seems to go. And he has no appreciation, I would say, for this understatement of the year, for the right to dissent, the right to free speech. In fact, it's sort of the definition of what an autocrat is, that they seek to shut down speech that they don't like. And so when he uses this phrase, illegal protests, really what he's doing is mixing things that are, of course, not protected, like incitement to violence, with things that certainly are not only protected, but enshrined in the First Amendment, right to free speech and the right to assembly. And, you see that in his tweet in particular, and we talked about this actually in the last episode of The Oath and the Office in Depth. John, in his Trump voice, read out the details of the Trump so-called truth, explaining why Khalil has been seized by the government, arrested, detained. And when you look through this mishmash, it's always a Trump mishmash, but it's very clear that the reason why Trump thinks and has ordered his arrest is to do with his beliefs. That, as much as he uses that word illegal protest, what Trump thinks is illegal is simply having sympathy, and that's the word that he uses, with groups that he doesn't agree with. Now, just to up the ante, his accusation, and I haven't seen any proof of this, is that Khalil is a sympathizer of Hamas. Now, again, I haven't seen any evidence of it, but even if he was, that would be protected speech. And that's one of the ideas that I'm trying to get out to the American people. So one of my lines that I've been repeating, and Mark, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess this is one of your favorite lines too, but is from the Blues Brothers when they're lined up in Illinois. And, I'm not an actor, but in my best actor voice, Bellucci says, Illinois Nazis. I hate Illinois Nazis, and then, of course, drive through. That's a reference to the Skokie case, which had recently been decided. And what the Supreme Court said there was that even the Nazis, with their swastika, the most evil set of beliefs that you could imagine, can't be punished in this country. Can they be criticized? Sure. Condemned? Yes, they should be. But you can't punish even that speech. So even if Khalil is a sympathizer with Hamas, which, again, no evidence that he is, he would certainly be protected. And that's not a controversial part of the First Amendment. So this, you also, I think, have to, it's not a case, of course, about anti-Semitism, although Trump is claiming that. It's really, if you tie these things together, part of the assault on the right to dissent. And what I've been saying is if he's not coming for you right now, he will be in the future, because if you disobey him, his view is you're engaged in a kind of illegal protest.
Yeah, I think we all feel on some level as though we may be eventually shut down or worse.
Right.
The thing about the Tesla protests being, if I'll just say, outlawed, and the Khalil relentless pursuit is that it's coming from him, the executive office. And that's why I'm glad I'm talking to you, because you can tell me, can the president just declare? I mean, it would seem maybe because of recent Supreme Court decisions that the president has a lot of latitude. Can he just declare this to be these people to be enemies of the state type thing?
No, absolutely not. And that's one of the, Trump himself wants to be an autocrat. And I should say this up front. So when it comes to what he can do in his mind, he's an authoritarian. And I've been using the word autocoup to describe what he's trying to do, which is to take the power of the office and turn it into an illegitimate power, far from co-equal branches, as you heard in that brilliant speech that I was so glad to hear from the Connecticut congressman. Instead of co-equal branches, he's really doing what a lot of Latin American countries' leaders have done, presidents, in collapsing the system, which is seizing control from the courts, from Congress, and even now from the Constitution, and declaring that he can do whatever he wants. But in terms of what he's allowed to do under the Constitution, absolutely not. The Constitution and its guarantee in the First Amendment that government shall not abridge the freedom of speech certainly applies to the president. And that's a long, hard-fought principle, but it's a bedrock one. I think the Supreme Court would, even now, although Trump is trying this auto coup, be too embarrassed to allow that to go forward when they get the Khalil case. But just to be clear, too, his argument is, well, there's a law passed mid-century, mid-20th century, that gives us the power to detain non-citizens who are being critical of the foreign policy of the United States. And that is true. There's a broad language in legislation from that period. But it doesn't matter, because in our system, the Constitution is higher than any statute. And in fact, there's a Supreme Court case from the 1940s saying exactly that the First Amendment, and multiple cases, I should say, the First Amendment and the Constitution doesn't just apply to citizens. Free speech is a protection of all. And just to add on, by the way, this isn't an undocumented person. He is in the country, not only legally, but as a green card holder.
Right, exactly. So he's been vetted as a green card holder. I mean, they don't just give out green cards without significant background checks, et cetera.
Right.
So he's gone through all of that. And so to have him now labeled in this way, it just runs counter to all of that, which I've just talked about, meaning, background checks, et cetera. So this will be appealed, and it'll be talked about more. Meanwhile, the political arsonist that Trump is and that Musk is, it seems to be there's a kind of wanton destruction over government that has seen the discharge of hundreds of thousands of federal workers. I mean, 80,000 from I think Social Security, and tens of thousands from the Park Service, et cetera. But even if, just with loose numbers, it's a lot of people. What is the legal status? Because today a judge has just said, hey, you can't dismiss all of these people. They must be rehired, and they must be rehired right away. Now that will be appealed. Take me through all of that, Corey Brettschneider, and then what is, in your judgment, the legal status of these decisions that Musk is making as to getting rid of a federal workforce?
There are about 45 cases that are pending in the courts at different stages. And what's happening is that in many of these cases, as you've mentioned, federal judges are putting a stop to what Musk is trying to do. But let me just try to back up a little bit and talk about what they all have together, and then I'll mention some of the details of these individual cases. What they share in common is that this attempted auto coup to seize power from Congress in particular and from the courts. Trump, I think, has executive functioning problems, so he needs somebody to carry it out. And in Musk, he's found somebody who's willing to actually go and try to figure out how you usurp the powers of Congress. And so the power of the purse, let's take it, lies famously with Congress. So part of what DOGE is doing that's illegal is stopping payments that have been allocated by Congress. But Musk doesn't care. He went into the Treasury Department, figured out where these payments were happening, same way he did with Twitter, basically, broke into the computer, just started stopping the payment. So in other words, there's the legal power of the purse, and then there's the actual purse. And Musk went and found it and stole it, essentially, stole the purse. So that's some of what's happening. The destruction of USAID and the Department of USAID, let's take that. That has been authorized by Congress. So Musk can't just abolish it the way that he wants to. That's the second case, which fits this pattern. And the third thing is there's a challenge to Musk himself and to DOGE's existence, because it looks like this isn't just an executive agency, but it's an executive agency and Musk himself, that rise above all the other cabinet officials. But what established it? And who confirmed Musk? If you're a principal officer of the United States, you're supposed to be confirmed by the Senate. And Musk, of course, hasn't been confirmed. So that's another case. So we could go through each of these, but they all have a familiar pattern, which is the usurpation of the powers of Congress and the separation of powers and stealing them literally by the presidency. That's why I've been using this term auto coup. By the way, that might sound extreme to people because it sounds like violence, but so many of the destructions of the presidential systems modeled on our own throughout Latin America, in places like Peru or in Venezuela, didn't happen through violence. They happened through presidents just doing what Musk is doing with Trump, seizing control of these other.
Yeah, I've called it a
nations.
soft coup, and
like
I
that
think
too.
that it's but it's also a creep. There's sort of like a more and more is being taken over by this crowd. The thing that surprises me a bit, just as we're talking, it just surprises me that they've been so very reckless and
Yeah.
so aggressive. So it's aggressiveness meets recklessness, and you end up. I get this, move fast and break stuff. I mean, I guess that's the cool thing that those tech
Right.
bros say,
Right.
but it's just bullshit. And when you deal with government, this isn't a startup and it's not
Yeah.
a business,
Right.
okay? So this crap and all your little cool phrases and your little, hoodies that you guys wear as you set up your laptops and hack into federal systems, that's not really the way things are done here. And the thing that surprises me, as I say, is that they have moved so recklessly. So the undoing of what they've done is actually painstaking. And I'm not so sure it in the end will be, that you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
That's right. And, that's the theme of the book that we talked about last time, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. The theme is that we have seen this kind of destruction before. And exactly as you say, it sometimes takes decades to put things back. And certainly multiple administrations, because destruction is a lot easier than building. And, I'll take a couple of examples. Let's take the first example. John Adams, to go back to our first conversation, not only threatens to shut down free speech the way that Trump is, he succeeds in it. He prosecutes about 126 political opponents, newspaper editors, and member of Congress, Matthew Lyons from Vermont, is imprisoned and wins re-election from prison. So he succeeds, John Adams, who's lauded, by the way, in miniseries and the way we do presidential history. We've just ignored threats to democracy like this one. So how did we fight back? The courts didn't save us there, and so I think there's a lesson in that. You would have thought, okay, there's a right to free speech that should be protected by the Supreme Court. But in fact, what happens is that one of the justices, Samuel Chase, actually goes and sits on the trial of one of the editors who's prosecuted, Thomas Cooper. And what he does is he ensures that Cooper can't even raise the issue of free speech in the first place, seeing to it that he's convicted. He lobbies for the passing of the law. So what does work? That's what Americans want to know right now. Where does the hope come from? What works is citizens actually fighting back against Adams, fighting back by using their own trials, in this case, the editors, as a way of putting John Adams on trial. And by putting John Adams on trial for the American people, the way they do it is not in a courtroom, but through the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson doesn't give a lot of speeches. The editors step into the void that is left by Jefferson's absence in campaigning, which I should say is pretty common at the time. And they use that election to elect Jefferson on the basis of there won't be a return of the Sedition Act. So Jefferson says, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. In other words, I'm going to restore this right of dissent. Now, to the question that we're on, it takes time to reestablish the norms. And in fact, Jefferson himself is not fully committed to it, and so seeks the prosecution of his political opponents at the same time that he pretends to care about free speech. But finally, during Madison, this norm that we see every week on Saturday Night Live, the right to dissent, is reestablished. So these cycles, and in the resistance to slavery that you get from Frederick Douglass, in the resistance to the nationalization, the first white supremacist president in Wilson, the resistance from people like Ida B. Wells and William Monroe Trotter, these take decades to really put things back. So as optimistic as I am that we can defeat this to really restore and come back better I should say, which should be the goal, not just restoration, but improvement, it's going to take time. And that's hard to tell people, who want to see immediate victory. But the damage
Sure.
is significant and going to be worse, I think, before it gets better.
Agreed. I mean, I don't even think you need to be a legal scholar to realize that, the damage will be substantial. And I don't know how you stop the bleeding, particularly given one of the first things you said and was noted all along the way, even in the ramp up before the guy was even inaugurated, was like, I don't get what this DOGE thing is. It doesn't seem like it's going to be legitimized in any way. I can see that maybe you could have Musk there. He's kind of a hood ornament, and he could recommend things that Congress will then decide upon, or more typically in the case of Congress, not decide upon. But it was just the opposite. He was anything but a hood ornament. Congress was the hood ornament,
Right.
and Musk and DOGE is all of a sudden this thing that we're talking about. Even notwithstanding what you've just said, or what you noted along the way, which is, this was just created out of thin air. It has no congressional approval.
Absolutely. And, there's, as Trump often does, there's two sides to what he's saying. One thing that he's saying is Musk is just recommending things. What are you talking about? That he's a principal officer and needs to be confirmed by the Senate. He's just giving recommendations. And that's what they're actually saying in court. That's what his lawyers are saying. It's the way that they're defending the idea that this appointment is in any way legal. And yet you heard him in the State of the Union say exactly the opposite, that Musk, he had him stand up and be recognized, that he's leading the charge and, for basically eliminating many functions of government. And, you saw that in the cabinet meeting where he essentially told cabinet members, you better listen to this guy. And so it is a kind of coup. That's why that language makes sense. Seizing control from the other branches. I should say, too, to go back to our original theme, that, some of these executive orders are kind of just obviously unconstitutional. The birthright citizenship is the one that stands out. But I also think the seizing of Khalil and these statements, although that some of these actions are blatant assaults on the Constitution, and I think some of them there'll be pushback. But here's the worrying thing: things like DOGE, many of these allocation functions. The Supreme Court itself is complicit in all of this because it has a theory that really dating back to the Mies Justice Department during Reagan, called the Unitary Executive. And it really is almost an invitation to the auto coup. It doesn't demand the auto coup, but it gives the president a lot of power over civil servants. And really, I mean, let's get down to brass tacks. A lot of this control is about whether or not the president can engage in political firing of civil servants. And since the 19th century, we've had the Pendleton Act and other legislation that protects against political firing. And the Supreme Court is just lining up, waiting to say, yeah, political firing by a president is fine. And they've had that agenda in mind for, conservatives, I should say, starting with this Mies Justice Department and justices like Scalia. So we're in trouble. I want to be hopeful. That's what my podcast is about. The president does take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. We've got to hold him to that. But at the same time, let's be honest here. This is really serious stuff.
Yeah, it does appear that a lot of the values that are wrapped up in the Constitution and that oath are just not being honored, and openly not being honored. I'm seeing in the chat, like, this isn't somebody saying it's not a soft coup. It's right here in plain sight. No, I get that it's in plain sight. When I say soft coup, I mean that it's not a violent coup. It's not a violent takeover. Even as he's, though, taken over the military, which I think is a sign of a growing coup, when you replace all the military leaders with loyalists, when you replace your entire administration with loyalists, a litmus test associated with the FBI and Justice Department service, that must make you sick. These people have to agree to the fact that the 2020 election was stolen. This is the litmus test they are giving federal employees. So right away, you are just populating that federal government under Trump with those who are all loyal to him.
And I've got to say, I'm glad that you focused in on the Department of Justice, because we've been talking generally about political firings, but where it matters most, I think, is in the Department of Justice. Last time, and previous to this moment, there are all sorts of protections for civil servants in the Justice Department. So when he tried to convince them to go along with his January 6th plot to steal the election, many of them, most of them actually, just resisted and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And they knew that they were protected from political firing. now what he's doing is just cleaning house. And I'm not seeing a lot of pushback in defense of the Pendleton Act. And although there'll be some suits, for instance, there's one about the National Labor Relations Board, about his power to engage in political firing. In that case, it's a slightly different topic about independent agencies. The court's going to back him up. And let's just not forget the granddaddy of them all, the unitary executive on steroids, as I call it, which is the immunity case. For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court said they'd never said a sitting president has immunity. They not only said that, but that a former president has immunity from his official, at least acting in his official duties. The official duties are the most dangerous. That's what Trump is saying in all these cases. So the court has really enabled this. I like that self-coup to get across the idea of nonviolence, and the auto-coup to get across the idea it's coming from the president swallowing up the other branches. And the court has just given him the keys to that auto-coup.
Indeed. Focusing on the court and then immunity, I think it's so right on. I mean, it's clearly. This Narek by the Sea says, what about the longest day House Republicans just enacted, which allows them to not vote on stopping the tariffs? Yeah, this is interesting. So just to, I mean, you can explain it probably better than I can, but essentially they have, the House Congress could block the tariffs. They could, well, the way they would do it is this emergency that he's declared, they would Bigfoot that, and they'd say it's not an emergency, so we're going to rule on the tariffs. Because the only way a president has the power to rule on the tariffs, as I understand it, Corey, is to declare this national emergency, which he's done, and now he is playing fast and loose with tariffs. And Congress has passed on this option by some wording that makes it not an entire day until the end of the term, I think, or the end of the year. I haven't read the wording, but maybe you can remind me what it is.
Well, there are a couple of issues here. One is that exactly right, that Congress could say, we're the lawmaking body here, and so we make the law, not you. And who are you to just unilaterally, remake America? And far from doing that, they're enabling him in this. So that's part of the problem. On emergencies, that's a huge and really important topic, and goes, I think, to our theme about recovery. Because part of the theme of the presidents and the people is that we never really recovered from Nixon, that the pardon in particular wiped away so many of the crimes and hid them from us. Nixon claimed, by the way, immunity. He said when a president does it, it's not illegal. That's another way we haven't recovered. The Supreme Court has essentially said that he was right. But there was a moment, and you'll see this is a long lead up to come back to emergency. There was an attempt to roll back presidential power with a crucial piece of legislation that actually Justice Scalia, when he was working in the Ford Office of Legal Counsel in the Ford Justice Department, really objected to. He thought it was going to be such a limit on presidential power. He hated it. It's called the Emergencies Act. And it said a very simple thing, which is that a bare majority of both houses could stop an emergency. If Trump's claiming emergency powers to set these tariffs, both houses could have in the past used this Emergency Act to stop it. Now, to make a long story short, Scalia hated this, and then rose, of course, to become the most influential justice and in a series of cases said that what he called legislative vetoes, like this one, majority of both houses just stopping a president, were unconstitutional. That you needed 2/3 to stop a majority, generally, of both houses to stop really presidential action. Anyway.
Wait. That's really important. So let me just ask you a follow-up quickly, and then we can get back to the original thread. So would Congress still need a 2/3 majority in order to stop this emergency? Okay.
That's because of Scalia.
Okay.
Congress amended the Emergencies Act. And now this is where, people like Fugel saying, and you have to stop me because I'm getting very wonky. The idea originally was both houses, just a majority, could stop a president. It was a very effective way of curbing presidential power. When you amend it to require 2/3 of both houses, that sounds like, okay, it's impossible. You can't get 2/3 of both houses to do anything. It essentially took this thing that was supposed to stop presidential power and instead did the opposite. It aggrandized it. So that's part of the story.
So for all this attention about how Congress has passed on this, and they did this awful thing, but they didn't have to even vote. I guess that was the true cowardice here. They didn't have to even see, well, we don't have 2/3. They just found a way to reword what a day is because, again, it was all about the number of days, et cetera. And so Trump can be the tariff king, and they have no say as to what will happen. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
And I should say too, again, just to widen out, it's not just tariffs. It's that they instead of waiting for courts to stop DOGE, they could be demanding confirmation hearings for Musk. Instead of allowing them to destroy USAID, they could pass legislation reaffirming its need. They could be doing in all of these cases, in 45, I think I mentioned at this stage, they could be shoring up their own power, and instead what they're doing is giving it over. And the Hitler analogy, I realize that people are very leery of it, but it is the most devastating auto coup in world history. And when you look at it, it was done in two ways. Some of it was through executive order. The Reichstag fire decree is one example, setting kind of emergency power. But there also was an enabling act, handing over power to the executive. And that's what's going on here, a series of enabling, actions by Congress. They're refusing to stop it anyway.
Exactly. No, it's enabling. It's tacit approval because they're not. We only have another minute or two. Depressed Canadian asking, weren't a lot of the unitary executive actions carried out under David Addington during W's administration? No.
The unitary executive has been around for a long time. It's a theory that really starts with Scalia and intellectuals in his orbit during the Meese Justice Department. And originally, it's a power of domestic power over hiring and firing. And essentially what it says is the president should have total control over everyone in the executive branch. The way the executive branch is organized currently, at least formally, is with lots of protection from political firing. The idea is we have laws on the books, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and civil servants' jobs is to carry out that legislation, so they shouldn't be fireable by a president just because he doesn't like them or doesn't want to follow the law. The idea is supposed to be the opposite. The president executes the law, doesn't make the law. Now, that's a kind of brief civics lesson, but this unitary executive says the opposite. No, the president should have total control. So Trump is using that now. Now, during the Bush White House, there was John Yoo and others used this theory to justify things like torture. Which is itself horrific. But in some ways, they're going back now to the core idea, which is, as crazy as this sounds, it's even more dangerous than torture because it's stripping all of us of our democracy. That's what they're using this theory to do.
It's depressing, and yet I feel it has to be talked about openly. I'm glad you have this podcast. Again, I'll mention it. You are the co-host of the Oath and the Office podcast. The Oath and the Office is the title of Corey's book. But you can see now it's become a podcast with John Fugelsang, the handsome, funny John Fugelsang. And
you have Trump's tie here, cutting through the Constitution.
That's pretty wild. And there is Corey, the always bright, sharp, and clear-headed Corey Brettschneider. Again, the book, The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it. And the reason that book might be something that is of interest to you if you're listening or watching is because, as you've just heard, history's instructive. And there are cases that actually draw out ways in which there has been pushback on situations that are, have seemed as dire as the one we're in. Right, Corey?
Thank you, Mark. And I'd say, I want to be honest, both in the podcast and I am in the book, about the history and the danger. At the founding, Patrick Henry said, if you ratify this thing, you're assuming a good person in power. What if you have a bad president? What if you have a criminal president? All of these supposed checks on executive power, impeachment, the courts, they're not going to work. But the hopeful part of the book and the podcast is that citizen power has worked. We push back against presidents like Adams, like Buchanan, who enabled the destruction of all rights, actually, for Black Americans under the Constitution. And we've won in a specific way, which is getting behind recovery presidents. And leading up to the midterms and to the next presidential election. That's what I'm going to continue to do, is work with people like you and John Fugelsang and try to build a democratic constitutional constituency, as they call it in the book. I outline the way to do it. These aren't just inspiring figures. They give us the roadmap specifically to recovery. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book and in the podcast too.
That's great. I'm going to add the podcast immediately, although it sounds like you've already got a considerable amount of momentum, which is really great. And you'll come visit again. I mean, people in the chat who weren't aware of you now are, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation, and we'll get into more. As I say, the book is so instructive in so many ways, so I'd like to get into that. And sadly, this administration is serving up problems and legal issues like a short order chef. So we'll have plenty to talk about. Thanks a lot, Corey.
Thanks a million, Mark. It's always a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Corey Brettschneider, everybody. See you. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.